2001, in the office of the Dean, there was a meeting between Professor Bouvet, who was academic secretary, and I myself. And we were discussing to develop a project on a higher level than the normal projects in the Research Council. At the time they called it GOA, Geconstateerde Onderzoeksactie. And thus we invited Professor Merriam, and we tried to convince him to join our group and our ideas. And that was probably the most difficult talk we ever had, for it was very difficult for Professor Merriam to believe that theologians could go for such a huge project. The last 6 years, Professor Merriam was the leader of the project of the third GOA project. This just to show you that even professors can be converted if you are able to convince them. And what did we do in that first project that started in 2003? We discussed the concept of orthodoxy in relation to truth. The next project was a logical step further. That was, we discussed the normativity of tradition, because tradition is always related to truth and to orthodoxy. And in the last project, we then discussed, as a logical next step, the crisis of religion, with a focus to the denomination we are best in, the Roman Catholic tradition. And so since 2003 up to 2020, we are developing new ideas, discussing new ideas, writing too many books about issues that are innerly related with theology, with church history, and let's say with the broader societal context.
Yes, so the challenge that the three projects always sought to address was how can insight into historical developments be conducive to gaining greater insight in the Christian tradition and in the dynamics of religion more in general. So the backbone of the project has been the interdisciplinary conversations between church historians and systematic theologians. And I think that even after the first project, but especially now towards the end of the third one, it's two things are actually interesting. The one is that there are still remaining issues, and so in a certain sense it's a kind of project that has raised more questions than that it has solved problems. And the second one is that the position of the methods and the ideas of church historians have changed, have been broadened, have been enlarged, and the attention of systematic theologians for conundrums in church history has also increased. So I think that talking within the disciplines of church history and systematic theology, it has been a clear win-win.
And you should be aware of the fact that before that common project that started in 2003, as far as I can remember, there was never a common project between systematic theologians and church historians. And most people were convinced that that was impossible, because church historians were in line with the historical critical method, the Louvain method, were developing, let us say, their research on the basis of archival material, on the basis of sources and the like. And the systematic theologians, they had it all in their head. They didn't need, as it were, data and books, but they were, as it were, inventing things themselves. And for me, the major result of the first GOA was that we discovered that there is much, that historical critical approaches have much in common with the hermeneutical theological approach. And the first time that we met, I think it was in Westmalle, it was a clash of ideas. There were people even doing like this on the table. Others were accusing us poor historians that we were relativistic, that we didn't believe in the real truth and things like that. And we were, I confess, we were accusing some of the systematic theologians of being fundamentalists and things like that. And that was the first book we published. And you can see that when you take the books here on the table, you clearly see how we gradually started to better understand each other. And if you ask me what is the main result of the 3 GOAs, that is that we have shown, that we have proved that 2 in theory different approaches when dealing with a common project can fruitfully dialogue with each other. No?
Yes, I think the Westmalle colloquium was memorable in more than one respect. But I remember,
maybe I can interrupt him, for I was at that moment already one of the seniors. In the evening after a hard day of hard work, we decided to drink Trappist of Westmalle. And when we went to the bar, I thought this must be enough for the whole week. Later on that evening, especially because of the youngsters, we had to ask the father responsible for the drinks to bring extra beer, because the youngsters had worked so hard that they were still needed some beer. We will never forget that. But that is not the result of the GOA, that was only an inspiring moment. Right?
It was inspiring. And so the Westmalle experience was very memorable. We all have very nice memories about that. But I remember more specifically, it's maybe a good example to show what we discovered in terms of those opposing methods, which we discovered are not really, are actually not antagonistic. So there was a discussion about one of the early councils of the church, I'm forgetting which one, and then the historians were saying actually this was just in the interest of the emperors. They were interested in having enough food supply for the city of Rome, and they put pressure on this church father and on that bishop. And that it was political, it was economic, and that actually, and then systematic theologians said, no, it is actually about what's the correct, the orthodox understanding of the position of Jesus Christ in the economy of salvation. And the big issue, and it is still an intellectual challenge, that is to understand how historical contingency can be bearer of truth. Not only in matters of religion we discovered, but also in other areas. For instance, nowadays in terms of political decisions, they're always the result of power issues, and it is not by dismantling or by mapping the power issues that are involved that it is excluded that some truth or some decisive moment for a tradition, for a community comes through is made impossible. And I think that this particular example of this council in the early church, but also of contemporary developments, shows that the historical contingency, how history just develops with the strange things that happen and that no one had really expected, can bear or can communicate things of a higher importance or of a broader nature.
And as a result, in then the second project, we started to discuss the question of continuity and discontinuity in history and the impact it can have on systematic theology. And in all the 3 projects we always had, let's say, a multidisciplinary team. So there were people who were more involved in or familiar with language, others were really serious historians, others had, as it were, a theological and a philosophical background, And so we discovered that much of what we say when we speak about continuity and discontinuity also has to do with the vocabulary we use. When a historian speaks about the continuity, he can see some line in history. When a theologian, philosopher is talking about continuity, but is doing it in a kind of aversion for postmodern theology, he will have another approach in continuity than a postmodern theologian who is very much influenced by philosophy. And also that for us was I think it was a real discovery, especially in the second project. The debates were more vehement, and if I may say so, more vehement, more rubbish between the theologians than between the church historians and the theologians. I will remember the huge debate where the two other promoters at a given moment about the value or the real knowledge of philosophy by some of the theological participants. And so that had to do with the fact that one was, let's say, a more traditional theologian, you can say that, yes, and the other was more interested in what postmodern theology had to say about the narratives of the so-called modern theology. And also that, in the end, resulted in a beautiful book, The Normativity of History, where we made clear that we have to avoid two ways. We have to avoid, in any way, the absolute relativism of some church historians. I think that we can say that we never ended up there. And we have to avoid the onto-theology of the so-called modern theologians. And in the end, we discovered, and I think that's a fantastic thing, we discovered that what is evident in our own history, Christ, truth, incarnation, that this is what is the answer. For then we are really in the midst of history, the truth incarnated in history, and thus flexible in the way it is thematized, in the way it is expressed. Think of the four Gospels, that are four narratives, different narratives about the same person and the same event. And when then you start reading history through that concept, then you discover that there is indeed discontinuity, yes, and continuity. And we also discovered that continuity sometimes is present even in periods that you think there is discontinuity. I think here, for instance, of the discussions we had about religious liberty, about the attitude to the Jews, we discovered that if you forget that, if you think that there is more than the 19th century, then there is much more interreligious dialogue in the history of Christianity than we had ever thought. And thus, continuity and discontinuity are interesting concepts, but they are concepts that you constantly have to put in a balance. You have to compare them. And this, I think that that is also one of the other great ideas about these GOAs, that we discovered that we have to broaden our scope, that we don't have to focus, and I think that we can say that, we don't have to focus on a narrow approach, for instance, in case of the so-called postmodern approaches, that you have to broaden your scope and then you discover things that never thought of. In that regard, I must say that one of the great things for me, and I think that for most of us, was that we constantly had to learn, by one of our colleagues, had to learn about John Henry Newman. John Henry Newman, well, I think that thanks to that colleague, he was made a saint last year. But Newman was, in many senses, an inspiration for the first on orthodoxy and truth, for the second on normativity, but also for the third on crisis.
Yeah. I think that, just to reinforce what you just said, the avoiding the extremes, that was an important exercise that we had collectively to go through. But in addition to that, we discovered that it is not by avoiding those extremes of indifferentism and relativism on the one hand, and of claiming speculative, dogmatic, propositional truth. On the other hand, in avoiding those two extremes, there is still many positions possible. And slowly but surely we developed some insights into the complexity of that. And we also discovered that issues of continuity and discontinuity are develop themselves independently of historical periods. You cannot say that today we live in a period of discontinuity and that, for instance, in the 1960s or in the interbellum there was more continuity. These categories, these central categories of our three projects, they have a heuristic, very important heuristic and hermeneutic potential, which makes us look at religious developments, especially in the Catholic tradition, with a very fine-tuned sensitivity for how complex these things are. And if I may add one more thing to that, it has always been of central importance to the three projects to study in detail case studies, from which then we extrapolate. But we cannot claim all those more general things that we are talking about now just by letting our free thoughts go. It is always documented in a very serious academic way. So we have really scrutinized texts by the Second Vatican Council, by Augustine, by John Henry Newman. So we have always opted for to develop further research with the help of serious case studies, from which then we can see dynamics and we can see patterns that we can then fruitfully extrapolate to other domains of knowledge.
That's true. But we also must say that we also have chosen, always have chosen in history topics that well fitted into our, let's say, our general lines. For instance, we focused on Augustine and the controversy. Pelagian controversy, the Donatus controversy. In the reception of Augustine, we focused on the controversy between the Louvain theologians and Luther, or on Jansenism. And with regard to then the contemporary history, we focused on Vatican II, but in light of what had happened in the period before, starting with modernism, and then with these suspected theologians like Doliva, Conrad, Chenu, Hahn, and so on. So the questions we asked about orthodoxy, truth, normativity were related to issues in history where these elements were at stake. Yeah. And the same is also true, well, that is what I discovered and what I learned from this review. The same is exactly true also in the contemporary theology. The differences, the oppositions, the disputes, the suspicions, they also have to do with, if I may say so, with the positions you take yourself and the background you defend yourself. I learned a lot, for instance, from your father. Maybe you can say something about your father, who was really an excellent example in our project, in our search for the relation between truth, orthodoxy, between the nature of orthodoxy and the content of, the context of orthodoxy.
Yeah, Bader is a virtually unknown 19th century German romantic who is of the same weight in a way as Hegel. And Hegel lived in a Protestant culture and in Berlin, and Bader was a kind of counterpart in Munich. But he's one of those interesting case studies that shows exactly this complexity, where Bader was not afraid in a turn immediately as a reaction also to certain rationalistic exaggerations of the Enlightenment, to very strongly defend the importance of the imagination, the importance of affections in laying bare truth. It's not so a pure positivistic objectivism is simply not the best warrant for truth. It may be that kind of truth that people with certain interests look for instance, to claim scientific certainty. But scientific certainty is not the only thing that matters when it comes to truth. and that if you take the risk, because it's a wager, to broaden your horizon, you come up with very interesting insights. And I think that Bader is a beautiful illustration of such an approach to truth, from which, that's what I try to show them, and I still bear some fruits from that research. That is what still matters today. It's not that there is something wrong with scientific truth and with objectivity and with claiming that you have certain facts, as long as you realize that this is not the only way that leads towards the truth. Mm-hmm. So the problem is not rationalism, the problem is not scientific certainty, the problem is always a reductionism. That is the only truth, and that the expectations that is the only way to, as we would say in the Christian regime, to salvation.
Mm-hmm. And of course, when you are dealing with these three topics and these three challenges, problems, Quaestiones disputatae, you discover, thanks to the distance, that the Bible, the source of Christianity, that can be interpreted in many different directions, both on the level of the original text, on the level of the translation, and on the level of the functioning in communities. For that was, as historians, also something we had to become aware of, that in many senses, communities, churches, or as it were, the place where the orthodoxy and truth is determined. So that's another first thing. The second thing is that when you're discussing during so many years these topics, you discover that it is not evident to claim that one denomination or one religion possesses the truth in opposition to the others. So especially in the second and also in the third project, the other religions became more and more important in order to better understand what is the normativity of history and what do we do with the other religions at a moment that there is a kind of crisis in, let us say, the Roman Catholic religion in Europe. And also there, I learned a lot of what our colleagues in systematic theology are doing with that. And what was new in the last project, which in my view was also very important, that is that experience, that lived religion, that liturgy, that sacramentology got its place in the reflection of church historians and of systematic theologians. I do know that before we started with the first GOA that there were already collaborations between sacramental theologians and systematic theologians. But now here we had, during 5 years, we had the input from people in pastoral theology, thus making clear that we not only discuss on academic level as systematic theologians and church historians these important notions, but that they also have to do with lived experience. Yeah. And that was in fact the role that you played in the third round.
Yeah, I think that the idea that liturgy as living communities that assemble, that gather, and that in their assemblies celebrate mysteries, and that through those historical contingent actions, some glimpses of mystery are shining, and that is itself not something to look at from on a hill, but that this experience itself is in and of itself already theology, not in the way that you should develop theological theories about these experiences, because then you have again a split between theory and practice. I think that what is really interesting is when you realize how fruitful and how potential and how strong it is that the practices themselves generate theological thinking. It is because we have celebrating communities that there is theology and not the other way around. Mm-hmm. That is very, very important. insight, both theological. It seems evident, but as all good theological insights, in essence, they're simple. But the generating potential of reflections that are born from liturgical and other ecclesial experiences is enormous. And if we had to think about yet another big research project, it could be designed, I think, according to those lines of research, because as of now we still do not know enough. We should refine our thinking and our methods to do justice to this enormous potential of liturgical experience.
But that's good. But I think that you will agree that at the end of all these years, that we do no longer think that we can do theology in an onto-theological way. And I think that you will agree that the layer for that was led in the very first project, orthodoxy, process and product. So I think that is what, if you ask me what is the greatest result, that is that we discovered that what we mean, or what we mean when we speak about orthodoxy, when we speak about truth, that it is something that is related to a process, and that at a given moment is a product, but that is not such a type of product that you can, as it were, say that it will be metaphysical, that it will be forever and ever.
I think that what these projects, and especially the results of the first one, has taught us is indeed that it is absolutely indispensable to leave behind some unnecessary dichotomies and that we have left behind some dualisms, and that our sensitivity for complexity has grown without that being offensive or inimical towards certain positions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that our research could be interesting for other ones at other faculties and other parts of the world to overcome certain fears that are connected with being too rigidly focused on one method or on one approach or on one theory or one ideology.
Mm-hmm. And what was also a great thing in the three projects, that is that you had a fruitful collaboration between seniors and youngsters. So that was one of the great things that we promised ourselves and also our sponsors from the very beginning, that we would try to collect the same amount of money outside the project as what we got in the project. And truth urges me, compels me to tell you that in all the three projects we were able to find more money outside the project than we got in the project. And I think that it had to do with the fact that we worked together, that we applied together for projects, that we helped each other in the writing of the project, that we discussed the projects once approved, and I think that there was a kind of a multiplicator effect in these projects. And so it was there, maybe it was true in the beginning, but gradually there was no longer the masters and the disciples, but it were the condiscipuli in scola Christi, that we were really working together. And I think that is also something when I am an old man, 154 years old, but I will still remember that is a collaboration with the youngsters and with the colleagues in a collegial way, and I really like that too. Mm-hmm. Another thing what I also observed when I was comparing the three projects, that is that in the last project the avenues were much more interdisciplinary than in the first project. In the first project we had a common interest, orthodoxy, process and product. There's a common layer, if you may say so. In the last project we no longer needed to look for the common layer that was there, no, we were really focusing on crisis of religion, and it was always an interaction between one of history with one of systematic theology.
Yeah.
And at a given moment, also interesting, but even it was an avenue where two systematic theologians had to meet each other.
And
And
they did.
And, well, whether they did or not, that is of course a matter of debate, because one of the four promoters had to leave the project because of another function. So, but let us say that they were underway to mutual understanding. However, whether they would ever have understood each other, that is something that we will discover in the life to come.
In the life to come.